Hi and welcome to this week's Sidebar, discussing episode 10 of our series on the case of Kane Story and Lee Clark. I'm here with Jacinda and Kevin, who are checking in from California. Hey guys.
Hey Susan.
Hey Susan.
So this week we have some disappointing news to start off with. We found out that the Attorney General's office in Georgia has decided to appeal in the Joey Watkins case. Now, Joey Watkins is another Floyd County case we covered in season 2 of Undisclosed, and he had a hearing earlier this year, and the judge ruled in his favor, overturning his conviction. So we were waiting to see what the state did. The state could have chosen to do nothing, in which case Joey would have gone back to Floyd County and be up to them to decide what to do. Or the Attorney General could decide to appeal it to the Supreme Court of Georgia. And that is ultimately what they have now decided to do. So we are disappointed primarily because of the time lost. Joey's claims are very strong legally. I'm honestly a little surprised they appealed. In most cases, you can assume that they're going to. But in this one, they just have such thin legal grounds that I managed to convince myself they might not do it. But they have, so we're now waiting probably 6 months, hopefully not too much longer, definitely end of the year, before Supreme Court of Georgia can rule on it, and we find out if they uphold the trial court's ruling and keep his conviction overturned, or if somehow they decide to overturn it and reinstate his conviction.
Now, does the Supreme Court have to tell you what points they're looking at or the basis of them looking at it?
Right now, all we know is that there's a notice of appeal filed by the state. We don't actually know what they're appealing on exactly. The thing is, Joey won on 3 different grounds, and the state would have to win on all 3 in order for his conviction to be overturned. So they'll have to target all 3 of them and have to win on all 3 of them. And if they don't run the board, then Joey still wins.
Oh, that's interesting. So even if they won on 1 conviction and not the other 2, it would still be an overturn?
It would. Any one of them standing alone is sufficient.
Yeah.
And he just, especially on, there's one claim in particular that his legal arguments are just so solid that it'll be interesting to see. I'm glad I'm not writing that brief, I'll put it that way, because I don't know what you'd write. In the trial court briefs after the hearing, the state's argument was that there was no evidence that the jurors had discussed a drive test one juror did, but then they have to recite the facts and mention that their own witness that they called to the stand was like, oh yeah, I remember the drive test being discussed. I just don't recall if it was a man or a woman. And so making the argument that it didn't happen when their own witness says it did, it's going to be a hard sell.
What's the time frame for Joey in this whole process?
Optimistically, I would hope for a ruling by like November, but the law being what it is, horrendously slow, it could push it to early 2023.
Was there a deadline for them to file the paperwork saying
yes.
they were
Today, Thursday, the 11th was the deadline, and they filed last week.
Could they have just filed it because they needed more time? Could they take back?
It's not a very common thing that happens, but theoretically they could withdraw their appeal.
Well, it's all very interesting. Have you spoken to Joey? How is he doing?
I have. He's disappointed. He had his hopes up a lot because you can almost always assume the state will appeal a conviction being overturned, but he really was thinking, because we were all really thinking, that they might not. So it was kind of a blow to go from having a bond hearing scheduled for next week to now knowing that he's still stuck there for 6 months more, at least.
Yeah.
But again, after we get out of the Supreme Court, he goes to Floyd County, and it's up to Floyd County to decide what to do. They can choose to either let him go or to put him on trial again. Once you have a conviction in place, it's all but impossible to get overturned, and it takes years, if not a decade, to get there.
Yeah, it's a long process.
But in this week's episode, we heard about a defense's case at trial that was put on for both Lee Clark and Kane Story. Now, the fact that Lee and Kane were tried together was probably the whole ballgame for Lee. What's interesting in the Joey Watkins case is that there were 2 defendants. Joey and his friend Mark were both charged. The theory was that Mark was somehow in the car with Joey when the shooting supposedly occurred, even though there's no evidence that he was actually there. Sounds familiar. But in that case, Joey and his co-defendant Mark got their trial severed. So they were not tried together. They each had their own trial, and Mark was acquitted. The jury found him not guilty, so he went home. In this case, the motion for severance was denied, so Lee and Kane were tried together. And absent that, I just can't even imagine a conviction here for Lee, given the amount of evidence they had against him was so minimal.
I mean, it's the whole concept of the conspiracy, right? You keep these guys together because they're in a conspiracy. Is that why it wasn't separated in your mind?
The same for Joey Watkins. That was a conspiracy between him and Mark. Again, they also made that one a gang case. They claimed that murder was because of a gang of 3 people with no name. Again, a nameless gang did it, despite, again, no evidence. But here, I don't know why the ruling was different. I haven't seen the judge's ruling on it, but the judge found that balancing the factors they look at, there was no reason to give Lee and Kane separate trials. We heard about Lee's defense, which, in terms of his case in chief, where he got to call witnesses to the stand, it was very brief. He called Dr. Harvey Howell, who said that this is a contact wound based on his analysis of the photographs. And then they called 2 witnesses to talk about Lee's alibi from that night. To me, there's no real reason to doubt where Lee was that evening, because there were probably 10 people in all who saw him at his apartment at like a gathering they were having, drinking, being stupid. Apparently someone lit some golden grain on fire and almost lit a table on fire, I've been told. And this night sticks out in everyone's memory because the next morning they find out that Brian was killed. So there's no reason to doubt that Lee was there at some point that night. The problem is putting a time on it and figuring out exactly when this occurred, because no one involved is really paying attention all that much to clocks.
Right. Well, and we also know no one disputes. I mean, Lee admits it, Jamie admits it, and Kane, that the 3 of them were together and driving around, and they dropped Kane off at the Silver Creek Mini Mart. And Kane says from there, he walked, behind the Mini Mart and up to where Brian lived. So, Jamie and Lee would have been on their way back to Lee's apartment.
Yeah. We don't know exactly how long it would have taken between when Kane was dropped off at the Mini Mart and when Brian was ultimately shot, but it wouldn't have been terribly long, we don't think, from what we know. So it's hard to say.
It's always stood out to me that no one interviewed Jamie, who was in the car, who would have been Lee's alibi witness. I know in the episode we talk about how he maybe isn't the greatest alibi witness because, he's Lee's brother and could say whatever. But to not even interview him seems like a mistake.
Especially since one part of the case that we're not going to cover in the show because it didn't go anywhere is there was a sort of troubled teen girl with a history of making false accusations against people who made a statement in this case. She talked to Dallas Maddle and David Stewart, and it was recorded, and she described in detail how Jamie was part of the murder conspiracy, and they had planned to kill Brian because of this narking thing and violating the gang rules and all that. And she's not used at trial because it's very apparent that her story can't be true, because she says that this thing occurs. She has a very firm date. She's like, me and Jamie were on a date at the Coosa Fair when he told me about how they killed Brian. And the Coosa Fair was like 2 weeks before Brian's death. So they ultimately don't go there with that witness. They don't call her. They kind of just like let it go. But they had that statement, so you'd think they'd want to talk to Jamie to like find out more about his alleged involvement in it.
Well, and Lee, they never really interviewed Lee either, right?
Yeah, well, they did. So they did try to interview Lee, and Lee was like, "I'm not talking to you," which is the right answer. Everyone out there, if you're ever brought into the police station and the officer wants to talk to you about something that you're being suspected of, do what Lee did. Don't talk. But Jamie's like, he said, "I would have talked. I don't know why they didn't come to me." They never tried though. We also heard this week about the witnesses called by the defense for Kane's story, which included Caprice. Now, she was called by the prosecution as well. The prosecution puts her on the stand to talk to her about stuff. She cries the whole time. She denies being involved, obviously, and says it didn't happen. But the questions they ask her paint the picture for the jury that she's part of this conspiracy for some reason that's never explained. The prosecutor even says in opening, he's like, now, Caprice was part of the conspiracy. Can I tell you why? No, I cannot, but she was. So.
It really said that?
Yeah, he's like, why would she do this? Who knows? But she did. That's not a direct quote, but it's very close to direct. He actually is very blatantly open about the fact that he cannot explain for the life of him why this teenage girl would help conspire to kill her boyfriend. But we also heard something interesting from Caprice that kind of struck me, which is that when we talked to her, she assumed, she thought that Kane and Lee were guilty, which I kind of hadn't expected, I think, going into it.
I remember her feeling like Lee was behind it all. She seemed a little more sympathetic towards Kane.
Yeah, she was part of it, but she thought that he was involved with it all.
Yeah.
But she was like, yeah, so Lee was outside the window, right? And we're like, where'd you hear that? She's like, I assume, well, Dallas Battle, I'm pretty sure, told me. So she has a story in her mind of what happened. the Dallas Battle most likely told her about how Lee shot Brian through a window. And she never really questioned that, despite the fact that she knew she was also accused of being a conspirator and that she knows that she heard Brian say on the phone he was playing Russian roulette. She heard all those years ago what Dallas Battle told her, and she's never really doubted that part of it.
Yeah, I was surprised when she told us that as well. Even though she was being accused of being part of the conspiracy, she still believed what she was being told by the investigators.
About Lee being seen there at the scene.
Yep.
We also heard her reaction to seeing Lee in the courtroom, and that was definitely not the only witness we've talked to who remembers Lee being having resting bitch face throughout the proceedings, or having an angry, stern look on his face much of the time.
Yeah, people talked about that a lot, and I always thought it's interesting that people interpret that as guilt or lack of remorse or whatever, versus just being like an angry 17, 18-year-old because you're being tried for a murder that, you say you didn't commit.
But that stuff matters, right? Like, people's perceptions matter when you're dealing in a trial and in a case. And
It does, but also when I see photos of them, part of me just doesn't understand it, because the perception to me, how do you look at those two boys and think, oh yeah, these are hardened gang murderers? They look way younger than 17. Was a really small guy. Kane's tall. He's like 6'2", 6'3", but he's like stick thin. And Lee's kind of a small guy. And they have baby faces to me. And there's nothing about them that would match this narrative being spun.
But you know them and you know the story, right? And
yeah, but even before I knew it, I saw photos of them. I was like, really? These are the gang members here? So after the conviction, Lee actually kept his attorney for the next legal proceedings, the next phase of it. He had the same attorney for his appeal. He also had the same attorney for the motion for a new trial that was filed directly after the conviction. And the judge that oversaw the case ruled in the motion. And what I thought was interesting, in the judge's ruling denying the motion for a new trial, he wrote the following about why Lee and Kane were convicted. The evidence shows that Story and Clark were members of a gang called the Freebirds, and that a short time before the shooting, Story, Clark, Bowling, and another young man committed the offense of burglarizing the home of Story's parents. A safe belonging to Story's father was stolen, and during the investigation, David Stewart interviewed Bowling, and he gave the police officer information which resulted in the arrest of Story and Clark. Now, if the judge sitting there through this trial drew that conclusion about the evidence being presented, the jury didn't have a hope, because that is blatantly false. Brian Bowling was not part of the safe robbery, even though the judge came away thinking that. And by the time any allegation is made that Brian ever talked to anyone in law enforcement, all 4 boys involved in the safe theft had already been arrested and charged. There's no evidence that there was any information from Brian that would have helped in the case at all. And also they didn't need it because they had confessions from the people involved. And they also had Debbie Kelly, who saw the car pull up to the Story's place that day. So Brian really couldn't have helped make a case against them. And again, not part of the safe robbery. And yet that's what the judge thought happened after watching over the trial.
Do you think the defense attorneys thought the same thing?
I wonder. It does seem like no one really knew what was going on. They do eventually, at one point, the prosecutor figures out the mistake, and he's like, oh yeah, Brian wasn't part of the safe theft. That's why he was so valuable as a witness. Because his opening statement's like, Brian was a crucial witness because he was part of the conspiracy and he was going to testify against Lee and Kane. And his closing is like, Brian was a crucial witness because he had nothing to do with the safe robbery, and therefore he was an independent witness, and that's why he was so crucial. So I guess it's heads, state wins, tails, defense loses.
But the judge, if that's in the prosecutor's closing argument, and for the judge to still make the mistake, that seems like somebody wasn't paying attention.
Yes, certainly there was a lack of attention paid by a lot of parties to this case. We also talked about Debbie Kelly again, the witness who lived next door to the Stories. She's also a cousin to the Stories. But Debbie Kelly, she's crucial to the case because this whole theory about narkers having to die, that comes from her. It doesn't come from anyone else. But trying to interview her was really a struggle because she was just an extremely leadable witness. And that happens, pretty often. But with her, I found myself struggling to formulate questions because anytime I said anything, she would adopt it into her answers, and it was making it difficult to get new information from her.
New information and to confirm old statements as well.
Yeah. Anything we asked her, she would basically adopt or spin off into a new answer.
Is it just an overwhelming desire to please or to feel important? She keeps changing her story based on the question or the information provided.
I think part of it for sure was just the natural tendency of any witness hearing about an old case. When you have fragments of memories you're trying to piece together, that'll happen with anyone. But it was just especially pronounced with her. I remember one time I misspoke asking a question, and I said Brian when I meant to say Kane. And instead of her telling me the story about Kane that I was trying to get from her, she tells a new story involving the same facts, only this time it involves Brian.
Yeah, it was an interesting exchange with her that day. Let's say that.
Yeah. She also told us about how...
Weren't there something about bird feathers on her doorstep or something?
Yes. Apparently, at some point back when this was happening, in 97 or 98, she came home and found bird feathers on her entryway. And she called Battle and Stewart, and they had to come offer protection to her because she was convinced that it was the Freebirds gang leaving a calling card.
She's an interesting interview, that's for sure.
Yeah. And we also heard from the other witness who saw the notebook, Nancy Williams, who told us she didn't remember testifying at the trial, which sounds unbelievable when you hear that. But I will say I have encountered that way more than I ever would have expected in working on old cases. It doesn't happen all the time, but semi-frequently, I will speak to someone who testified in a trial 20, 25 years ago, and they will just flat out insist they didn't testify. And when they see their testimony, they're shocked because, yes, they did, but they've literally forgotten it. So it can and does happen.
It just seems so impossible to sort of understand that. I mean, if one is an expert witness, you can understand that they may not remember testifying because they do it all the time. But presumably, she's never testified in another court case in her life.
We didn't ask her that, but I have spoken to witnesses who tell me, when I ask them, they're like, oh, that's impossible because I've never testified in any case ever. So I'm less skeptical now, having heard it several times from people who I'm confident aren't lying to me. Even though the first time I encountered it, I remember being just blown away. I'm like, how could you possibly not remember testifying? I didn't believe the witness. And then later on, I came to realize, it's probably true. He probably just forgot because it wasn't a big deal to him, I think it's also possibly an indication that what they're talking about at trial was not something that important to them, or in any event, it didn't leave a memory because outside of the testimony they gave, it didn't really create an impact in their long-term memories, which could be the case for Nancy Williams because her memory now of this gang rule book was very much tamer than it was when she was testifying at trial.
Right. When we talked to her, she described it more as just kids being kids kind of thing and not really anything scary or anything that she saw and was afraid of.
Yeah. And her kids were like, oh, yeah, if mom was cleaning a house and saw something kind of interesting like that, she'd totally go through it. And Kane says that it was just a song notebook. I think he told me that the actual title of it was Songs and Shit. Literally that was written on it with the skull and crossbones.
He remembered some of the names of the songs, even.
He remembered quite a few. I took some of them out, but he was telling me about some of the love songs he wrote. And wow, so in my head, I was imagining that maybe the songbook was full of violent rap lyrics talking about drug use or something. But from everything I've heard from both Kane and others, it wasn't like that. It was just some grunge rock, but nothing in the lyrics themselves that would cause that kind of reaction from Debbie Kelly or Nancy Williams.
So the big mystery is what happened to this book. We know it existed in some form because Kane says, yes, he had a notebook of lyrics. But where is it? What happened to it?
We just don't know. Ideally, I wish the stories would have been able to find it and have it. Then again, it was 7 months after the shooting that there's any indication that the notebook's important, and we don't know when the defense finds out. It probably was not even till much later on. So by the time Kane's reason to know that the notebook matters, probably at least a year. So maybe he just misplaced it, got a new one, lost it, who knows?
There was never a warrant to search his house to look for it or anything like that.
No, there was not. because they thought it was in the casket. So that's where they went to look for it.
It's this mythical piece of evidence that nobody but these other two have ever really seen, right?
Yep.
And it's used as this sort of this big thing about this conspiracy, but it's never been produced.
And as we heard in the episode, the jury should never have heard about it because it was hearsay and it was not admissible under any of the exceptions that they could have used. Like, it shouldn't have been part of this case in the first place.
Does that mean if there was ever a new trial, because the judge made, the Supreme Court, I believe, made that ruling, that the rule book would not be allowed to be evidence in a new trial?
It'd be up to the trial court to rule on it again, but likely not, given the Supreme Court's ruling on it before.
And it becomes even more difficult to prove a conspiracy if you don't have this mythical rule book.
Or if you don't have Battle's hearsay testimony about what Charlie supposedly saw.
Right.
We also heard about the testimony that Cain gave at his own trial and how that negatively affected Lee Clark's defense as well.
I mean, it's the one thing that points towards people thinking he was guilty, right? Like, he's looking for who the narc is, and you can place him at the mini mart 200 yards from the house. And that's the one thing that stands out as people conceivably thinking that Lee could be involved, because you can place him in proximity and he's already upset that he's looking for a narc. So that's the smoking gun that the prosecution is trying to present, right?
It seems like this is what actually started the investigation into Lee Clark. Why Lee and not someone else, when there were supposedly other Freebirds, supposedly other people who would theoretically have an equal motive to do this based on the state's theory of the case? Like, why do they focus on Lee? And it's because they talked to Cain very early on, and Cain tells them what he did that day. So they know he's with Lee Clark.
One of the things that stood out for me about this episode is Lee's father, Glenn. And I think it becomes clear to the audience how difficult this whole process has been for him. And on the show, we keep looking at the evidence, and it's compelling evidence. I think that the emotion and the damage that we can hear sort of done to him in this episode really stood out for me. I mean, I remember when Jacinda and I shot that interview, and I believe it was March of 2021. And seeing how much this story what had happened had sort of changed his life. Sitting there doing the interview, it was very profound. And then it brought back a lot of memories for me of watching him go through that, explaining it to us. And we were speaking to him as Lee called him. It was a pretty intense moment.
Yeah, for 25 years, he's been Lee's primary contact with the outside world. And he's wanted to get his son help, but he just did not know what or how to do it. He doesn't have the money to hire attorneys and fight it to the end. He doesn't know where to turn, and he wants to help his son, but he just literally doesn't know how to do it.
Yeah, and in talking to us, I think he viewed this as an opportunity to finally get Lee's story out to the world, which is what he'd been looking for and what he told us he'd been praying for.
We had a lot of great listener comments and questions this week. We had one from @Mardunter on Twitter who said, one glaring problem I have with the state's theory is that if the murder was the plan, why wouldn't they both, Cain and Lee, have gone through the plywood bedroom window? It was common practice among his friends and would have avoided all witnesses. Just one more thing that makes no sense with the theory. And in short, yes. To me, it's a simple thing, but also it's such a fundamentally hard thing to understand about the state's case. Like, why have Cain go through the front door? Why have Cain put on a scene like that? And why does Cain agree to be the one who goes in the front door and is visibly known to be with the victim, whereas Lee is able to, theoretically get away with no one seeing there at all, when they both just could have gone through the window if they'd wanted to?
You know, I was thinking about this the other night, actually, about why did Cain go through the front door when everyone says, normally he would just go through the back window. And it made sense to me because if he's walking from the mini mart, he's walking towards the house and he's going to come to the front door first. If he's coming from his home, he would be coming towards the back of Brian's trailer, where it'd make more sense to come through the window. The Bowling family, they remember it being odd that he came through the front door. But because of the direction he was coming, I don't think it was odd.
But also, like, he was comfortable with the Bowling family. Like, he would live with them for a bit after his father kicked him out because of safe theft. So, I mean, it had been the place he was living for like 2 weeks there just before this all happened. So he was pretty comfortable coming and going there as he pleased. And like, I remember thinking in this case when I started working on it, like maybe Kane's acting weird or uncomfortable because he had like pistol in his pocket. But according to Brian's mother, like, he tells her as he's coming in the door, he's got a pistol in his pocket and he's out target shooting before this.
The thing that struck, I think, Kenneth and Amanda as odd, as I remember talking to them, was that he knocked on the door, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's not even that he came in the front door, it's that he knocked.
Yeah.
Like, that normally he would just walk in.
But he could see in the window, because that's where Charles supposedly sees that later, and sees that there's company over. To me, it doesn't stand out that strange. And again, no one has a statement recorded right away, so we're dealing with statements that came months or even more than a year later on. But there's also like some suggestion that the knocking that was so weird to them was not the knocking on the front door, but the knocking on Brian's door. Because there's several people who recall him knocking on Brian's bedroom door after he came in. Brian asking, "Who is it?" And Kane saying, "It's me, buddy." And then Brian saying, "Come in." So it's not clear if the knocking was strange because it was on the front door or it was on Brian's bedroom door. We also got a question from Minus Wit Humor on Twitter, who wrote that both the experts in the forensics episode mentioned burning from hot gases and that gunpowder could burn into the bone. Could that burnt bone still hold gunpowder chemical residue? Is exhumation possible? Well, whether exhumation is possible, you'd have to go through the courts. I don't know how likely it is that anyone would win that motion. Kane has actually tried that before. He tried to move the court to have the body exhumed to check just that, and he was denied. So previously that's gone nowhere. But assuming an exhumation could occur, then actually, yeah, there's probably a pretty good chance that you could determine for certain if it was or was not a contact wound. If it was a contact wound, there should be gunpowder and soot etched into the bone itself, which could still be determined and found. And we also had a question from Casey Williams on Instagram, and she asked, how exactly or why did they make an arrest on Lee Clark prior to Charlie's statement? Y'all mentioned he was already in custody when Charlie talked to police. That whole thing happened 3 days after Lee's and Kane's arrest. The arrest of Lee and Kane came after, first, the statements from Angela Bruce, who had the party where she says the boys confessed, and the statement from Debbie Kelly when she says in the Narc's rule book. Within a span of like 4 days, they talk to these witnesses, and then they make the arrest right away, and it's only after that they talk to Charlie. So the arrest itself was based on the confession at the party and the gang rule book.
We also got a question by email from Monique, who asked, shouldn't it be a huge conflict of interest that the lady who cleaned the house and saw the notebook and went to testify was also working with police and interviewing Kane?
It's not so much a conflict of interest because it wouldn't preclude her from testifying, but it's something that could have been used to impeach her and to undermine her credibility that the defense did not really utilize. It's just a very strange situation all around as well. It's not clear how or why this arrangement was allowed to occur. All we know is that Debbie Kelly is apparently inserting herself into the case of the stolen safe and doing what she can to get that solved for David Stewart.
We also had a few people write in to find out when and if we'll be hearing from Craig Burns.
We will be hearing from Craig Burns. Not this week, but I believe the week after that.
What's on the next episode?
Next episode, we are discussing the Freebirds and who or what they actually were. And we're also hearing from a witness that the police never talked to, which is Joseph Wilkins, who drew the Weed Eagle note found in Brian's casket. Thanks for listening to this episode of Proof Sidebar. If you have any questions for future Sidebar episodes, don't forget to send them our way through email, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. On all social media, we are Proof Crime Pod. You can find me on Twitter at TheViewFromLO2 and on Instagram at SOOSimp. And you can now find Jacinda on Instagram too, at Jacinda Proof.